So in today's video, I'm going to talk a little bit about Antler. There's some tips and things and what to look out for. So a viewer reached out to me with all these very, very good questions, and I'm very glad to cover all of this. So some things to consider with purchasing Antler. Not all species of deer antler are suitable for Netsuke carving. As much as I'd love to give you a comprehensive list on every suitable and unsuitable species of antler, I don't know it. I know off the top of my head that the antler you would find typically in pet stores is too soft for Netsuke carving. That's more appropriate for a dog to chew on, not so much for a Netsuke to work on. So right here, this is obviously quite segmented now. This at one point was actually two antlers, or one set of two antlers that came from a chittle deer. In the state of Victoria, in Australia, where I live, deer are a very invasive species. They were introduced off probably at some point in the 19th century, and there are so many of them about, so there aren't really any restrictions to acquiring deer antler. And there are so many different species of deer that are currently in Victoria. So this is a chittle deer. I think originally might have been from India or something like that. I don't know. Now, some places will sell the antler either intact. This is all, as I said, two pieces or two long bits of antler. Or sometimes they'll sell certain fragments and bits. I would actually recommend to go for the entire thing, and I'll explain why. So the viewer that got in touch with me, they wanted to know what parts of the antler can be used. You can use virtually any part of the antler. It's really limited to your imagination, the overall size of the antler, the species of deer, all of that. So I'm going to show you some completed Netsuke. First I'm going to show you some antique pieces. Give me 2 seconds. And here we go. These are two 19th century pieces, probably late 19th century. And you'll see that both of them come from the very crown of the deer. That's the part that sticks into the head, the very base of the antler. This would have come from a very small deer. And you can see this Netsuke here very carefully use the sort of the purling on the base to suggest a cloak on this little tanuki priest character. I think it's trying to be, I can't remember. Yes, and a similar thing has happened here. These two little karako, the Chinese boys, and they're playing some sort of a gambling game with a die. Most of the purling has been left intact, leaving a nice space. It's quite solid as well, yes. So as you can see, the crown of the antler is obviously very much desired amongst Netsuke. This is a crown of a chittle antler. There's a lot of bulk to deal with. And I'll show you something I've done with said bulk. Well, I'm currently working on it as well. I'm working on a few pieces. This one here. If you're wondering why it's looking so stained, even though it's not finished, I will stain these pieces many times over to figure out exactly where I need to carve, polish it all, re-engrave, all those sorts of things, and that will happen over and over again until I can progress to the finer stages of polishing, and then eventually the final colouring be put in place. So you can see I've even started to put all the himatoshi is already in place. I'm starting to work on some things at the bottom. Yes. Now that, of course, while the crown is the most desirable, and sometimes you can actually just get entirely in just the crown part alone, you don't be limited with just the crown. You can do so much with the Netsuke. I've used a lot of the central part of the antler. Those little like branch things that would connect there. Sorry, I'm not that familiar with the anatomy of the antler. This is one of the first antler Netsuke ever made. The Netsuke of the Grim Reaper. It's entirely made of antler. Yes, so it comes from a more central part of the antler. So they're great for figures. You have to sort of really tuck it away in places and all. These two are also made from the center part of the antler. Yes, this is an okimono I carved imitating wood spirit. I left most of the purling, that's this outer part of the antler, intact. I carved the face inside of here. Yes, I left this part rough to make it look like wood grain. And the stain has made it very clear the anatomy of the antler. So the outer part that's a bit paler, that's quite hard. This part in the middle is very porous. You don't want to go too much into it. There are some exceptions to the rule, but this part is very brittle. If I start drilling into these holes here, it will collapse, that little part there. That will change a lot depending on the species of antler. Some deer, it's just spongy marrow all in the middle. That is just, you cannot work with that. That alone is difficult to work with. Same story, this one's a little bit more subtle. I played around a lot with the unshed staining. I'll talk a little bit about staining and finishing antler in a moment. So this is one of the I think the tines or prongs or whatever they're called. This one's a very thick one. There was the other. It's interesting. One antler was much bigger than the other, even though this was from the same deer. This would have come from about here or something like that. Yes, you can do a lot of things with this. People like using this for yurde or maybe some fish or something. You can do so much with it. Heck, you can just cut this part off and use this cylindrical part. I've seen all of this being used, a whole piece like that being used for a tengu by I can't remember who the carver is. I think he's Russian or Ukrainian or something like that. Yes, and as you get further along the antler, it will start to get a bit on the flat side. And look, you've got another bulky part there. That's not the crown. And you can do a lot of things with that if you keep most of that reasonably intact. Sorry, this is the right way it's going here. This Antler Netsuke that I'm currently working on, that's roughly what it would have looked like originally. And while we're back at this Netsuke for a moment, I'll just quickly show you where it's at. Here you can see that I've put the stain and I've removed it all. This entire thing was as dark as this. And I keep on removing it very carefully by scraping, shaving, whatever verb you like to use. Very difficult if you're just relying on seeing these things. I can tell already that's not that neat. But the staining will make it even clearer what's going on, how many scratches are in place, all of those things that are very important to carving. Now all these holes you see, while I didn't plug them up on the other Netsuke I showed you, this one, because I really hollowed it out a lot, these holes need to be plugged up. The worst offender is just about there. Let's see if I can, with the camera, there. It's even larger than it's being shown in camera. There's a lot of like blood vessels and things running in the antler, and every time I boil it, they sort of, I don't know, congeal a little, not congeal, what's the word? They liquefy a bit, and then I'm able to, I actually blow into the ends, whatever ends, to get all this disgusting marrowy or bloody stuff out, and I'll use other tools to scrape it out clean. Yes, and I sometimes, if it's a bit too hard to do that, I might use certain chemicals like hydrogen peroxide and some other things. Hydrogen peroxide is not great for antler, for the record, but I do sometimes use it to kill the blood that's going on. Yeah, you can see right through, right there. Wow, I've never seen that quite like that before. Yes, and as you can see here, if you look at the base of I think it's meant to be a lamppost or something like that, it's very rough because I've gone right into that center part. Normally I wouldn't go in that deeply, but because it looks like wood, which is what this is meant to be, it's actually not so bad, but I'm having a rough time trying to carve it all. It's taken me a long time. Now, as far as whether the antler should be from a shed deer or from a deer that's been, dealt with to get the antler. So when you look at the base of the antler, obviously this has been sawed off. When I originally got it, it had something like this attached to it. Yes, that fits directly into the little cavity in the deer's head. As far as whether shed or unshed is better, what I will say is that as long as the antler is in very good condition, it hasn't been sitting in the sun for too long, it should be fine. If you look at this outer part, the purling, I think it's called, this brown, I don't know, dirt or whatever it is, when that's been left out in the sun, it bleaches. And as the antler bleaches due to the sunlight, it degrades and becomes very brittle. You don't want that. So ideally you want something that looks fresh like this one. This was a somewhat expensive piece of antler. It was a decorative piece of antler, the person sold it to me as. I asked them what antler that he had in stock would be suitable for Netsuke, and he suggested this. He didn't know what Netsuke were initially, but after he looked it up, he suggested the Chito antler. He said it's as hard as a rock. And that's the thing, it's a very heavy and dense material. Very heavy indeed. Oh, and there's so many other parts of the antler I completely forgot about. For example, as you get further up here, these parts here can absolutely be used for a Netsuke. Let's be creative. These flat, these flat parts here, while it doesn't look like you can do much with them, bit of imagination. Look, I've already started to work on himatoshi. Some sketch work on himatoshi. I'm not sure exactly what to turn it into, but the possibilities are virtually endless. And then you get this other flat part too. You get the smaller points, which I'm using mostly for inlaying. So that's why I think it's better to just buy the whole thing in one go. Because comparatively speaking, if you're just buying crowns, you're probably going to pay a bit more than you would normally for just buying the whole thing together. And make sure you're buying antler that's free from cracks, really good quality. If you can go to the supplier directly, that's great. Obviously, that's not always an option. So as far as finishing is concerned, to give it specifically an antique finish, it depends on exactly what you're after. These would have been done roughly with probably, sumi ink or something when... Okay. If we want an antique finish or not, I'm not exactly sure what method this is. It's a lot. It could be yashadama and sumi ink, which is fairly standard, even in ivory. That would explain why it's so orangey like this one. It could also be incense smoke. I don't know, there are lots of things it could be. I'm not 100% sure. But anyway, the simplest way I do it is yashadama, the aldercone stain. It works much more on antler than it does on boxwood or ivory. Because the antler is so porous, it really just soaks it in. And the yashadama is boiling hot. I don't put it directly in a boiling solution of yashadama. What I do is I'll bring up the yashadama to boil, quickly take it off the stove, and then put the Netsuke in there and allow it to colour. Then the whole thing will be incredibly dark, like it would have been all this colour, and then I would have polished all these areas around a lot more. It will mellow out a bit with age, and then I would have put a bit of sumi ink in places, rubbed it off, all of that. The hat is sumi ink, it's not an inlay. And the final coating for protecting, I use ibotaro wax. I use this for every Netsuke, regardless of what it's made of. Yes, I melt it on a spoon, and I put it on a piece of old t-shirt, like an old cloth. And then I rub the wax on, and then it gives a protective coating, and it gives a nice gloss to it. I absolutely love ibotaro wax. I'm not a fan of oils on anything, especially wood. Yes. As for some of the differences with ivory, so overall, the finish I just described of the yashadama and sumi ink, that absolutely is applicable to ivory. The yashadama won't be so prominent on the ivory so much as it is on a stag antler. They are overall quite different materials. So ivory is made of keratin. That's the same stuff as your fingernails and your hair. Antler is basically bone. So it's much denser than antler. Sorry, it's much denser than ivory by a long shot, and much heavier too. If this were a piece of ivory, this would actually be a bit lighter. Yes. Now, in case you're wondering, so this is obviously Chichel deer antler. This japonica, or whatever it's called, Nippon deer, I think it's hard to say which one is denser of the two. They're both pretty darn dense. I always assumed that, deer antler, or Japanese deer antler, must have been a lot harder. When I tried Chichel antler, while certainly much denser than ivory, I suspect it's probably a little bit softer than what they used in Japan, but I'm not 100% sure. So in terms of overall carving technique, it's what you've seen me do on my other videos is more or less what I do on antler as well. So in actuality, I'm an ivory carver. I don't do it commercially. My stockpile, I haven't added to it in years. It's all above board. So I'm not going to say anything more about it, but I learned to carve Netsuke from an ivory carving perspective, and I apply it to all these other materials. Yes, but I wouldn't use the more standard woodworking techniques like whittling. It's a disaster if you're going to try to whittle. You can do some things, but you have to do very thin shavings of it. Yeah, so it does work. Now, it took me maybe a good week to build up enough strength in my hands to carve this. When I first carved Chichel antler, my hands were so inflamed I could not carve for a good week. That's how strong I found it initially, but I've got enough strength in my hands to do it. So the carving techniques are much of a muchness with ivory. Look, when it comes to Netsuke carvers are either wood specialist or bone specialist, and then I say there's the versatile mixed specialist, but in reality it'll be one or the other. So you take a carver like Masatoshi, who I mentioned in my previous video. He was very much, he came from an ivory carving background and then was encouraged to carve wood. The techniques are all much of a muchness. There are some differences in wood, ivory, and boxwood carving, of course. With Antler, typically you would have thicker tools. My tools are not as thick as as I should be making them. I make them from a perspective of carving ivory, but they still work, and they don't suffer any severe stress on Antler, so it's not much of a problem for me. If you'd like to get into Antler carving, but you've only done boxwood or some other woods, my advice is to go for tagua nut. It's I'm not sure what to call it, a seed or a fruit from the vegetable palm. The skin is quite hard. When you remove the skin, you get this beautiful ivory-coloured flesh. It's quite hard, and even though it's this, let's face it, plant material, it feels luxurious. It feels like a proper material. Yes. Now, this is half a tagua nut. I sawed it in half. The inside is slightly hollow, and there's a brittle part in here as well. But this is much easier and softer to carve than Antler. It's a little bit softer than ivory, certainly. It's more brittle than ivory, but it can take the detail. So if you are wanting to transition into Antler or just give it a try, make sure you're able to carve a tagua nut first. Again, very similar scraping technique. When it comes to the rough shaving of Antler, I do use this exact file I showed in my last video. There are more specific files for ivory carving. They're the more suitable ones. And I will, oops, here, that's not the right, not the safest thing to do, but yeah. There are a variety of chemicals and things I could suggest that would really give it an antique look. I'm not a big fan of using chemicals just to mimic age. I don't like that so much. I know I sort of did it in one of my other videos. Yes, honestly, you're better off just putting it again in yashadama. And really, if you want it not so orangey, don't leave it in the solution for too long and really rub it off. And it won't look so bright. I actually like the contrast in this one. I really wanted to give it a nice colour. And it's nice to actually be able to use yashadama. Because in boxwood, it's just, to try and get this boxwood is very difficult with yashadama. Almost, not impossible, but almost impossible. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope this has clarified a few things. I will eventually do some, some tutorials on Antler carving, things that can be done with pieces of Antler, and I think I might even do a tagua nut tutorial. This piece is inspiring me quite a lot. Yes, but first and foremost, I'm working on a tutorial for a boxwood Netsuke, something that you guys can actually follow, not what I've been doing, which is, let's face it, promotional work. I'm always open to suggestions for new videos, so thank you to all the viewers who have been reaching out to me and asking all these great questions. I truly appreciate it. Now, if you excuse me, Days of Our Lives is on at the moment, so I'll let you go, okay? Ta-ta.